Files in Apache Parquet format can now also be supported by FAMOS, so we can import them simply by, for example, by dragging them in from the Explorer, and we can see these channels, which are each 1 million samples, can be plotted and used and displayed. And we can also export them, so we can convert normal files to Parquet files for uploading into a cloud, for example. And also we have the preview, not just like here inside of FAMOS, but even now in the Explorer. If you activate the preview of the Windows Explorer, you can see the content of the file just quickly before even loading it. As you know, maybe from other files in IMC format, now this works also for Parquet files. And we have similar support for MDF4 files. We have improved the support for MDF4 files. So for example, a file like this can be also previewed in the Windows Explorer. Specifically, you can see all the file comments, all the file information to make your decision which file to use for analyzing, sending to the colleagues, or uploading to the database before loading it. And this preview is quick also for very large files with thousands of channels included. For better support of database storages, cloud storages, we now have the database kit included in the FAMOS Enterprise Edition. It's not necessary to purchase this extra anymore. So now you can use the FAMOS Enterprise to directly connect, for example, to MariaDB, MySQL, MS SQL servers, and things like this. Cutting data into intervals and working with periodic data in general is a lot easier than ever before now. For example, here we have a speed signal which is going up and down and which is relatively noisy, looking into the detail. And now it just requires 2 lines of sequence, which I have put behind the button to cut out all the sections where the speed is increasing and calculate the slopes. It's also easily possible now, for example, here to take 2 signals which have been acquired together. This is an altitude signal of an airplane and it is the air brake angle signal. So we can see whenever the red signal is up, the air brakes are on, and we can see what that is doing to the altitude signal. And also here, with just a few lines of sequence, I can cut out all the sections of altitude where the air brakes are on with a threshold of 0.5 degrees. So I cut this out, I see all the sections, and this has been done in a lot less than a second for around 2.5 million samples. A third example is a shaft which is rotating. So we see the angle of rotation in detail in the bottom blue line. And the top graph is just a zoomed out version of this. And we see the strain is doing something once per revolution. And when I calculate this, I am quickly getting the maximum value for each revolution. And if I zoom out here, I can see the histogram of all the max amplitudes across all 7,000 revolutions calculated in just 100 milliseconds, and just with very few lines we can have a look what's behind the button. So it's really just these 3 lines and some timing functions. The AI assistant has been improved a lot in FAMOS 2026. It is still here in this tool window to the right of the main window, and you can ask it anything to help you find the right calculation function or write a sequence. So for example, I can just ask, what is a third octave analysis? And you will see I'm getting a lot more detailed, a lot more accurate answer than previously, with more examples and more descriptions and more summaries. So in this case, I have even asked something which is not really FAMOS specific. So I'm getting a general explanation and I'm getting some example, and then I can ask follow-up questions or turn it around and say, look, I have a sequence from my colleague doing some analysis. Can you explain what it's doing? Creating multi-page reports that match, that fit together because they have the same layout is a lot easier now, because, for example, I can insert a page and just pick the template that I have defined for myself, and I'm getting such a page ready to use that I just fill in the main content. And also it's possible to define such layouts as master pages like in PowerPoint, so that they adapt changes in the master automatically. For example, when I use this one as a master and I modify the style here, export it back into the repository, then I can go to the other pages and say, you update, and all of the pages adapt and change their appearance automatically. Bar meters can now be switched between vertical and horizontal style. So I can now create these curves like on the left, operate them in any way that I'm used to from the previous display styles, and switch it around just in the general orientation settings, switch it between vertical and horizontal, and enable, for example, the values, the last value of each channel. Markers can now be exactly snapped to samples. Previously, I was able to move them around like this, sticking to the line. Now it's also possible, if I hold down the control key, that they exactly stop at the samples, and I can make sure, for example, I'm really getting the peak value. This is also working for measurement cursors. So here I can also again move them, and as previously I can jump around with holding the shift key, so I can directly jump this cursor to a certain location, and when I hold down the control key instead, it's locking into single samples, and I can measure what's the distance between these two peaks, for example. We have improved the toolbar of the curve windows. So for example, it's now just one click to open a twin window and maybe open a second twin window from there and connect the two together so that the one is linked to the other and I can use them for navigation. Also, we have improved the measurement window. So you can see when I open this, I have a color indication. So now I can easily see that third line with the values measured between the two cursors. That is speed, and speed is this light blue line. Also, there's more analysis functions, and this window now remembers the analysis functions you picked last time. So you can use it again in a quicker way than before. The quick view window now respects the time axis setting that you prefer. So as you see right now, I have linear setting. That means number of seconds since beginning of the test. But if my default is relative time, so I set this as default, now I see the hours, minutes, and seconds since the beginning, and now every new window will show up like this, independent of what it is. Any setting that I define as my default, except of course, for example, I have a data set like this. This is a spectrum, so of course the time axis is not a time axis, but it's a frequency axis. Exporting data to CSV or Excel has become more flexible. For example, if I want to export the speed signal to CSV, I now am able to define a format that is outputting the timestamps in ISO format, and that's outputting a footer additionally to data at the very end. And I can also have days of the week embedded and all kinds of things like this. Even it's possible now to export canvas logs. So normally inside FAMOS they look like this. Exporting them to Excel was not properly possible so far, but now I can do this. The options to do that have been expanded. So here I can define whether this should be exported as canvas messages, standard ASCII, and so on. And therefore I can select, for example, something like this, save this, and see that it pops up here and shows in a nice readable way in Excel that I can, of course, even use for filtering. So if I go and filter the data and then concentrate on a certain message ID, then I can do this simply by filtering. The vibration filters in FAMOS have been extended. As you may know, there's a function called vibration filter, and that includes a lot of varieties of ISO standards to do frequency weighting. Now there's a new addition here, number 41, flat H for hand transmitted vibrations according to the ISO standards. Many functions are now easier to use in FAMOS. For example, my favorite convert unit that I can use, for example, to say 1.3 bar of pressure. How much is that in PSI? I just write something like this, only 2 parameters instead of 3 as it was in the past, and I have my result. Another example is this data set. This is a set of 18 single values. If I want to know what's the maximum out of all of these, I can join this group together into a single data set and then simply calculate the max, maybe like this, and I have the maximum of 10,600 amps. This is also easier than before, again, because we have stripped away optional parameters. FAMOS 2026 now also offers the Hilbert transformation. So if you sometimes have the task to calculate an envelope curve, now you can use the Hilbert transformation that is implemented as a sequence function, looks like this, with the typical help and example section. For durability analysis, we now have a kind of library for SN curves according to Eurocode. So you can now pick, according to Eurocode, the detail category, and automatically you get the SN curve populated. This is additionally to the British standard that we had before and the manual calculation of ascent curves by factors. And this is included in the demo project Durability and Fatigue, which automatically also calculates the damage ratio according to this, the lifetime in hours and years. The packaging of ready-made projects like apps is now better in FAMOS 2026. For example, I have a project here which is for teaching people how windowing effects have results on FFT spectra. And on this project, I can, for example, say I have a couple of algorithms and I have the dashboard and everything, and I can go in here and in one shot, based on multi-selection, protect everything with a password so that nobody can modify this anymore. Nobody can see my intellectual property, how this works in the background. Everything is protected like a compiled software now. Also, the projects can now include a lot more like how the layout of the software, of the FAMOS software in general, should be like. For example, here the variable list is pretty normal and flat, and I have the name, unit, and the sampling time and time offset in the list. But if I go and open another project, for example, a project which is made for analyzing canvas logs, that maybe changes completely. I don't see as many columns anymore, but instead my channels, which in this example are 1000 channels, are now structured in a tree so that I can, in an easier way, find the channels and work with them. Also, the projects can have a much nicer influence to the general user interface of FAMOS so that operating the projects is streamlined in the maximum way. Not so many steps are necessary, not so many clicks are necessary. For example, if I go into this demo project, to the page for the UI actions, I can use automated sequences or buttons to switch the FAMOS view for operating, like for comparing test runs or not comparing test runs, opening the spreadsheets and looking at values, or minimizing FAMOS when my analysis is completed. Dashboards, or panels as we call it, in FAMOS can now be customized even more. For example, I can have input boxes which force the user to input certain type of numbers, for example, integer numbers which cannot have any digits, or real numbers with 2 digits, something which is already including a unit, or maybe a serial number with a certain number of places.